The cold marble of the bathroom floor seemed to seep directly into my bones, freezing the blood in my veins. I stood perfectly still, the oversized white tuxedo shirt clinging to my shoulders, staring blindly at my own pale reflection in the gilded mirror. The phone was still pressed against my ear, though Marcus had already hung up. The dial tone hummed in the silent room like a flatlining heartbeat. Richard Vance hadn't just called my bluff. He had bypassed the game entirely and set the board on fire. I knew men like him existed, men who moved human lives around like insignificant chess pieces, but feeling the crushing weight of that power directed entirely at me was suffocating. My father's debt wasn't just a number on a piece of paper. It was a violent, bleeding wound that had dictated every single choice I had made for the last 5 years. It was the reason I smiled at strangers in dimly lit VIP rooms. It was the reason I wore dark satin corsets and pretended my heart was made of stone. The men who held that debt did not negotiate. They communicated through broken ribs, shattered glass, and sudden, terrifying disappearances in the dead of night. And now, Richard Vance owned them. He owned my debt, which meant he owned my safety, my future, and my life. I slowly lowered the phone, placing it onto the edge of the marble sink with a trembling hand. My reflection looked like a ghost of the woman who had boldly claimed the billionaire heiress on the red carpet just hours ago. The arrogant, protective escort who had sneered at Julian Croft was entirely gone. In her place was just a terrified girl standing in a $40 million cage, realizing the door had just locked from the outside. I closed my eyes, dragging in a ragged, oxygen-starved breath. The scent of Camilla's custom perfume still lingered heavily on the collar of the shirt I was wearing, crushed bergamot and dark cedar. It smelled like safety. It smelled like the intoxicating warmth of the woman sleeping just a few feet away in the master bedroom. My chest tightened with an agonizing physical ache. I had broken the cardinal rule of my profession. I hadn't just crossed a professional boundary. I had let her in. I had let the Ice Queen melt in my arms, and in the process, I had completely surrendered my own heavily guarded heart. But staying with her now was an impossible, lethal luxury. If I stayed, Richard Vance would not hesitate to destroy me. He would unleash the hounds he had just purchased. They would drag me back into the violent shadows of the underground, and the resulting scandal would be permanently stained with Camilla's name. I would become the ultimate weapon her father used to prove she was unstable, reckless, and unfit to lead the Vance empire. To protect the woman sleeping in the next room, I had to completely shatter her heart. I had to become exactly what she always feared everyone was. Someone who could be bought. Someone who was only playing a part. I turned on the brass faucet, letting the icy water run over my trembling fingers. I splashed the freezing water onto my face, forcing the panic to recede into a dark, tightly locked box in the back of my mind. I watched my reflection shift, the soft vulnerability hardening back into cynical, impenetrable armor. The decision was made. It was the only logical play left on the board. I turned off the water, drying my fists with a pristine white monogrammed towel. I took one last deep breath, gripping the brass handle of the bathroom door. I pushed it open and stepped back into the sunlit master suite. The golden light of the early morning was spilling across the massive bed, catching the dust motes dancing in the silent air. Camilla shifted against the luxurious Egyptian cotton sheets. She murmured something soft and unintelligible, reaching her arm out blindly across the empty space where I had been lying. Her hand fell against the mattress, and her brow furrowed slightly in her sleep. Slowly, her heavy eyelids fluttered open. The glacial blue of her eyes was softened by sleep, and entirely devoid of the terrifying walls she usually kept up. She saw me standing near the bathroom door and offered a small, sleepy, and devastatingly genuine smile. It was a smile nobody else in the world got to see. "You're awake," Camilla whispered, her voice husky and entirely stripped of its usual commanding edge. She pushed herself up against the plush pillows, the white sheets falling to pool around her waist. She looked so incredibly beautiful, bathed in the morning light, her pale blonde hair a chaotic, gorgeous mess. Every single instinct in my body screamed at me to walk over there, climb back into that bed, and pull her into my arms. I wanted to bury my face in her neck and tell her everything. I wanted to tell her that her father was a monster and that we could run away together. But I knew the reality of the world we lived in. Billionaires didn't run away. They fought wars in boardrooms, and casualties like me were simply swept under the rug. I crossed my arms over my chest, pulling the oversized tuxedo shirt tighter around myself as a physical barrier. I kept my expression entirely blank, expertly constructing the mask of the untouchable professional. "I have to go," I said, my voice smooth, steady, and terrifyingly cold. Camilla's sleepy smile faltered. The warmth in her eyes hitched, a shadow of confusion passing over her beautiful features. "Go?" she repeated, sitting up slightly straighter, sensing the sudden drastic shift in the temperature of the room. "It's 6 a.m, Nadia." "My shift is over, Miss Vance," I replied, deliberately using her formal title. The words tasted like ash in my mouth. I walked over to the velvet chair where my deep burgundy silk gown from last night had been discarded. I picked it up, my movements calculated and entirely detached. "What are you talking about?" Camilla asked, the confusion morphing into a sharp, sudden anxiety. She pulled the sheet up slightly, a defensive gesture that absolutely broke my heart. "I thought," she started, her voice breaking on a fragile note. "You thought last night meant something," I finished for her, not looking at her as I began to untangle the delicate straps of the gown. I forced a short, cynical laugh that sounded incredibly hollow even to my own ears. "Camilla, you paid for an exclusive, highly convincing +1. I finally turned to look at her, making sure my dark eyes conveyed absolutely nothing but professional indifference. "You needed to ruin your father's engagement announcement, and I needed to ensure the performance was unforgettable." "A performance?" she echoed, the color completely draining from her face. "Sleeping with the client isn't usually in my contract." I lied flawlessly, driving the knife in deeper with every word. "But considering the hazard pay involved with publicly humiliating Richard Vance, I considered it a necessary bonus." The silence in the master suite became suddenly deafening. The golden morning light felt entirely wrong, illuminating a scene of absolute devastation. I watched the Ice Queen return. It was a terrifying, heartbreaking transformation to witness in real time. The soft, vulnerable girl I had held in the dark vanished behind a wall of impenetrable, freezing glass. Her jaw clenched, the sharp, aristocratic lines of her face hardening into polished marble. "I see," Camilla said. Her voice was no longer husky with sleep. It was a razor-sharp whisper that cut straight through the air. She didn't yell. She didn't cry. She simply locked the cage back up, shutting me out entirely. "I am sorry if the lines became blurred for you," I continued, desperate to end this before my own resolve crumbled completely. "But in my line of work, we give the client exactly what they need." "And you thought I needed to be played?" she stated, her glacial blue eyes pinning me to the spot with absolute freezing hatred. "I thought you needed an escape," I corrected softly, grabbing my small clutch purse from the floor. "I'll have Larkus forward the final invoice for the night to your assistant." "Don't bother," Camilla spat, her voice dripping with venom. She pointed a trembling finger toward the heavy double doors of the bedroom. "Get out." I didn't hesitate. I turned on my heel and walked out of the bedroom, not looking back. I walked down the long, shadowed corridor of the penthouse in the oversized shirt, clutching my silk dress in my arms. Every step away from her felt like tearing a muscle. I reached the private elevator and hit the call button, my hands shaking so violently I could barely keep my grip on my purse. The stainless steel doors slid open with a quiet ding. I stepped inside the sterile, mirrored box. The doors closed, sealing me off from the $40 million velvet cage. As the elevator began its rapid descent toward the lobby, the cynical, untouchable escort mask completely disintegrated. I leaned against the cold metal wall and finally allowed the first tear to fall. The descent felt like it took an eternity. The numbers flashing on the digital display above the door rapidly counted down, dropping me out of the clouds and back into the gritty reality of the city. Floor 60, floor 40, floor 20. With every passing floor, the suffocating realization of my situation settled deeper into my chest. I had just blown up the most lucrative, dangerous contract of my life. I had irreparably broken the heart of the only woman who had ever truly looked at me, and I was still entirely at the mercy of Richard Vance. By leaving Camilla, I had given her father exactly what he wanted. I had removed myself from the equation, proving to her that I was exactly the sort of cheap, transactional mistake he had warned her about. But did that mean my debt was forgiven? Or did it simply mean the hounds were going to be unleashed anyway, just to tie up a loose end? The elevator came to a smooth, silent halt at the subterranean parking level. The doors opened to reveal the stark, concrete pillars and the harsh fluorescent lights of the garage. I stepped out, the chill of the underground air biting through the thin white silk of Camilla's shirt. I quickly pulled the deep burgundy gown over my head, struggling with the delicate fabric with shaking hands. I shivered, discarding the white tuxedo shirt onto a nearby concrete barrier. It felt like leaving a piece of my own soul behind. I slipped my high heels back on, the sharp clicking echoing loudly in the empty parking structure. I needed to get back to my apartment. I needed to pack whatever I could carry and disappear before Marcus realized I had left the penthouse. If Richard Vance's men were looking for me, my apartment would be the first place they would go. I walked quickly toward the pedestrian exit, keeping my head down, my eyes scanning the shadows behind the parked luxury cars. Every shadow looked like a threat. Every distant sound of a car engine made my heart hammer violently against my ribs. I pushed open the heavy metal exit door and stepped out onto the gray, rain-slicked streets of morning Manhattan. The city was just beginning to wake up. Delivery trucks rumbled past, splashing dirty water onto the sidewalk. People in suits hurried toward subway stations, clutching hot coffees and avoiding eye contact. Nobody looked twice at the woman in the ruined, expensive red silk gown, walking quickly through the early morning mist. I was just another ghost in a city full of them. I pulled my phone from my clutch, my thumb hovering over the screen. I had 3 missed calls from Marcus, 2 text messages from an unknown number. I opened the messages, my breath catching in my throat. The first message was a picture. It was a photograph of the front door of my apartment building, taken from the street. The second message was a single line of text. "We are waiting, Nadia." A wave of pure, paralyzing terror washed over me. I stopped walking, staring blindly at the screen of my phone. I couldn't go home. I couldn't go back to the club. I had nowhere to hide. Richard Vance hadn't just bought my debt, he had bought the entire city, and he was squeezing his fist shut. I stood on the corner of the busy intersection, the cold morning rain beginning to fall harder, soaking the expensive silk of my dress. I was completely alone. I had sacrificed everything to keep Camilla safe, but the game was over. It had only just begun, and I was rapidly running out of places to run. The rain in New York doesn't wash away sins, it only makes the streets slicker for the predators. I kept my head down, pulling my clutch tight against my shivering body, ignoring the biting cold that seeped through the ruined burgundy silk. My apartment was compromised, my workplace was a trap, and my bank accounts were undoubtedly already frozen by Richard Vance's fixers. I had exactly $42 in cash and a dead-end future. I needed to disappear before the sun fully breached the Manhattan skyline. I slipped into a crowded underground subway station, letting the chaotic ordering rush hours swallow me whole. I rode the train for over an hour, changing lines randomly, making sure I wasn't being followed by any men in sharp, tailored suits. I finally surfaced in Queens, miles away from the glittering skyscrapers that belonged to the Vance empire. I walked toward an old rusted iron door tucked in a dark alley behind a rundown laundromat. It was a relic from my father's dangerous past, a neutral ground run by a man named Elias, who specialized in making desperate people vanish. I knocked 3 times, paused, and knocked twice more. The heavy door creaked open, revealing Elias's weathered face and sharply skeptical eyes. He took one look at my soaked designer gown and my pale, terrified face, before pulling me inside and locking the heavy deadbolt. The back room smelled of stale tobacco, damp concrete, and bitter black coffee. I collapsed onto a worn leather sofa, my entire body shaking uncontrollably as the adrenaline finally crashed out of my system. Elias handed me a heavy wool blanket and a steaming mug without asking a single question. "Vance called in the debt," I rasped, the hot ceramic burning my freezing hands. Elias froze in his tracks, his dark eyes widening in genuine, undisguised alarm. "Richard Vance? The billionaire patriarch?" I nodded slowly, taking a sip of the bitter liquid to stop my teeth from violently chattering. Elias cursed loudly under his breath, walking over to a heavy metal safe hidden in the corner of the room. "If Richard Vance wants you found, Nadia, hiding in my basement isn't going to save your life." He pulled out a thick brown envelope and tossed it onto the scarred coffee table in front of me. "There's a clean driver's license, $2,000 in untraceable cash, and a bus ticket to a border town in Texas. He leave in exactly 1 hour, and you never ever come back to New York." I stared blankly at the brown envelope resting on the table. It was exactly what I had desperately wanted for years. A clean slate, a way out of the suffocating underground world. But looking at that paper ticket, I felt absolutely nothing but a hollow, agonizing void in my chest. If I got on that bus, I would live to see tomorrow. But I would be leaving Camilla completely alone in a golden cage filled with starving wolves. I had deliberately shattered her heart this morning to protect her, to prove to her that I was just another transaction. But what if breaking her heart only made her more vulnerable to her father's ruthless control? Suddenly, the small, ancient television sitting on Elias's cluttered desk flickered with breaking morning news. The volume was entirely muted, but the bold red ticker scrolling at the bottom of the screen screamed the headline: "Vance Empire in Crisis. Heiress Camilla Vance calls emergency board meeting to challenge chairman." I scrambled off the sofa, dropping the blanket, my heart hammering violently against my ribs as I stared at the screen. The broadcast showed live helicopter footage hovering over the massive Vance corporate headquarters. Then, the camera abruptly cut to a ground-level shot of Camilla arriving at the glass doors of the building. She wasn't hiding from the press. She wasn't crying in her penthouse over a broken heart. She was wearing a razor-sharp, midnight black suit, her posture radiating an absolute terrifying aura of lethal intent. Her glacial blue eyes stared directly into the flashing cameras with a cold, devastating fury that I had never seen before. She wasn't the terrified girl I had held in the dark just hours ago. She was going to war, and she was doing it completely alone, facing down the most powerful men in the city. Richard Vance thought he had won by threatening me and removing me from the board, expecting his daughter to finally fall back into obedient submission. Instead, he had just forced the Ice Queen to detonate the foundation of the entire empire. A sudden, overwhelming surge of fierce pride and deep, agonizing love flooded my chest, stealing the breath from my lungs. I looked down at the brown envelope containing my safe, quiet escape. Then, I looked back at the glowing screen, at the breathtaking woman who was risking everything she had ever known because she finally realized she refused to be controlled. I couldn't run away. I couldn't let her fight a monster all by herself. I turned back to Elias, my hands suddenly steady, the trembling completely gone. "I don't need the bus ticket," I said, my voice hardening into impenetrable steel. Elias looked at me like I had completely lost my mind. "Nadia, they will kill you before the sun sets." "They have to find me first," I replied smoothly, a dark, cynical smile slowly curving my crimson lips. "And while they are busy looking for me in the gutters, I'm going to burn their entire house down from the inside." I needed leverage. I needed the kind of nuclear dirt that could destroy Richard Vance before he could destroy us. And working in the VIP rooms of the Obsidian for 5 years meant I knew exactly where the untouchable elite buried their darkest, most ruinous secrets. I turned to Elias, the scared escort vanishing completely, replaced by the woman who was about to orchestrate the greatest revenge the city had ever seen. "I need a secure laptop, a burner phone, and access to the club's hidden server." The game wasn't over. Richard Vance wanted to play dirty, but he forgot one crucial, fatal detail about the world outside his penthouse. I didn't grow up in a sterile boardroom. I grew up fighting for survival in the shadows. And in the shadows, the escort always knows more than the king. The glowing screen of the secure laptop illuminated the dark, damp basement in Queens. My fingers flew across the keyboard with a desperate, frantic precision I didn't know I possessed. Elias stood behind me, his arms crossed tightly, watching the encrypted firewalls of the Obsidian's hidden server fall one by one. In the underground world, absolute discretion was the product we sold to the elite, but leverage was the actual currency that kept the club alive. Marcus kept digital ledgers of every illegal transaction, every offshore wire transfer, and every dirty secret whispered in the VIP rooms. I just needed to find the specific ghost account belonging to the architect of my nightmare. "Richard Vance doesn't leave fingerprints," Elias warned softly, his eyes scanning the rapid streams of code. "Everyone leaves fingerprints when they think no one is watching," I replied, my voice cold and entirely focused. I bypassed the general client registry and dug directly into the black market escrow accounts. I searched for the exact date my father's massive debt was mysteriously purchased. The digital trail was buried under layers of shell companies, but the arrogance of wealth always left a pattern. I found the routing number, matching it to an offshore holding company located in the Cayman Islands. Then, I cross-referenced that holding company with the Vance Empire's internal corporate tax filings that were leaked to the dark web last year. The screen suddenly flashed green, unlocking a massive cache of hidden financial documents. My breath caught sharply in my throat as I read the ledgers. Richard Vance hadn't just bought my debt to control his daughter. He had been systematically embezzling hundreds of millions of dollars from his own board of directors for the last 5 years to fund illegal, high-risk acquisitions. And the most terrifying part was the signature authorizing every single fraudulent wire transfer. It was Camilla's forged signature. He had framed his own daughter, setting her up to take the absolute fall if the federal investigators ever breached the Vance Empire. He was going to lock her in a cage and let her burn to save his own legacy. "He's a monster," Elias whispered, staring at the undeniable proof of the ultimate betrayal. "Print it," I commanded, pulling a silver encrypted flash drive from my pocket. "Download every single file onto this drive, Elias. Nadia, if you walk into that corporate building with this, you are painting a permanent target on your back," he warned, his voice heavy with genuine concern. I stood up from the desk, smoothing down the ruined burgundy silk of my gown with trembling hands. "He already painted the target, Elias, but I am the one holding the gun." I grabbed the silver flash drive, shoving it deep into my clutch. The morning storm had intensified by the time I emerged from the subway in the financial district. The Vance corporate headquarters loomed in the gray mist like a monolithic fortress of glass and steel. I bypassed the main lobby, slipping through the underground executive parking garage using a cloned security badge Elias had provided. My high heels clicked sharply against the polished concrete as I navigated the labyrinth of service elevators. I pressed the button for the top floor, the sheer speed of the ascent making my stomach drop. The elevator doors opened to reveal the silent, heavily guarded executive floor. 2 massive security guards in dark suits stepped forward immediately, blocking the entrance to the main boardroom. "This floor is restricted," the first guard stated, reaching out to grab my arm. I didn't step back, and I didn't flinch. I looked him dead in the eyes, channeling every single ounce of the terrifying, untouchable aura I had learned from watching Camilla Vance. "I am the personal guest of the CEO, and I am holding documents that will dictate whether you have a job tomorrow morning." I lied flawlessly, my voice dripping with absolute authority. "Touch me, and you will be answering to Camilla Vance personally." The guard hesitated for a crucial, fatal fraction of a second. It was all the time I needed to step past him, gripping the heavy brass handles of the boardroom doors. I shoved the doors open with a violent force that sent a deafening echo throughout the massive room. The chaotic shouting inside instantly died. 20 incredibly powerful board members sat frozen around a sprawling mahogany table, staring at the woman in the soaked, ruined red dress standing in the doorway. At the far end of the table stood Camilla. She looked entirely exhausted, completely surrounded, and devastatingly beautiful in her sharp black suit. At the head of the table sat Richard Vance, wearing a smug, victorious smile that completely vanished the exact second he saw my face. "Security!" Richard roared, his composure finally shattering. "Remove this woman immediately!" Camilla's glacial blue eyes locked onto mine. a storm of shock, hot and desperate hope swirling in their depths. She didn't know why I was here. She thought I had taken the money and run, leaving her to face the firing squad alone. I didn't look at the guards rushing into the room behind me. I walked straight toward the head of the mahogany table, my gaze fixed entirely on the billionaire patriarch. I reached into my clutch, pulling out the silver flash drive, and slammed it onto the polished wood directly in front of him. The metal clattered sharply, spinning to a halt near his gold fountain pen. Because if those guards lay a finger on me, every single financial news outlet in the country receives the contents of that drive. Richard stared at the small silver device, as if it were a live hand grenade. "What is the meaning of this?" an older board member demanded, standing up furiously. "Who is this woman, Richard?" I turned to face the entire board of directors, refusing to be intimidated by the wealth in the room. "My name is Nadia," I stated clearly, letting the absolute truth ring out. "And that drive contains the complete, unredacted offshore ledgers of Richard Vance's shadow accounts." A collective, horrified gasp rippled through the room. "It proves that your esteemed chairman has been embezzling corporate funds for 5 years to bankroll illegal acquisitions in the Cayman Islands." I turned my head slowly, locking eyes with Richard, who had gone frighteningly pale. "And it completely proves that he has been forging his own daughter's signature to frame her for the federal crimes he committed." The absolute silence that followed was heavy enough to crush bone. The board members immediately scrambled toward the table, demanding the drive be projected onto the main screen. Richard didn't try to stop them. He slumped back into his leather chair, the terrifying architect of the Vance empire completely disintegrating before my eyes. He knew it was over. He knew that in the corporate world, stealing from your own investors was the only unforgivable sin. I didn't wait to watch the execution. I turned around, my eyes immediately finding Camilla. She was standing perfectly still, her chest heaving as she stared at me with an expression of pure, overwhelming realization. She finally understood why I had shattered her heart this morning. She knew I had lied to protect her, to distance myself before I brought the wrath of the underworld to her doorstep. And she knew I had just walked into the center of the fire to save her life. I walked toward her, the space between us charged with an undeniable electric pull that absolutely commanded the room. The board members were screaming at Richard behind us, but the chaos simply faded into white noise. I stopped just a breath away from her, the scent of crushed bergamot wrapping around my exhausted senses. "You came back," Camilla whispered, her voice breaking on a completely unguarded, vulnerable sob. "I never actually left, Camilla," I murmured softly, reaching out to gently brush a stray blonde curl from her forehead. "I just needed to find a sledgehammer big enough to smash your cage." Her glacial blue eyes filled with hot, blinding tears that she no longer bothered to hide. Without caring about the 20 board members watching us, without caring about the flashing cameras or the ruined empire groveling in the background, the ice queen moved. She grabbed the lapels of my soaked dress, pulling me flush against her body. She crashed her lips against mine with a desperate, starving ferocity that stole the remaining breath from my lungs. It was a kiss that tasted like survival, like tears, and like an absolute, unbreakable promise. I wrapped my arms tightly around her neck, anchoring her to me as the Vance corporate world burned to the ground behind us. The contract was officially broken, the debts were erased, and the dangerous game was finally over. For the first time in my entire life, I wasn't playing a role. I was exactly where I was meant to be, holding the only woman in the world who could afford the one thing I could never sell, my completely, entirely devoted heart.